I don't actually remember when I first started writing poems. My mum reckons that when I was a kid I used to dictate things to her and make her write them down, which must have driven her crazy. And she said that when I was quite young I sort of dictated a poem to her, and I suppose I just kept writing away ever since then really. Though the first time I started taking writing a bit more seriously that I can remember was when I was at university and had a pamphlet that was going to be published, and started, I suppose, thinking of audience a bit more when I was working on things. And I just remember at that time, and maybe it's part of that time of your life when you're a student, everything seems very new and exciting, but I remember that when I was writing poetry, it was the time that I felt most alive. It's like the way I always think of writing is it's like a quickening of something. Like the world seems to get a little bit quicker when you're working on a poem, I think. You're noticing things much more acutely, I guess. And my writing's just slowed down gradually since then, so I write less and less each year, I think. Yeah, the poem that springs to mind the most actually is Wilfred Owen, the poet that springs to mind, and particularly his poem Futility, about the sun waking, but imagining that the sun could wake the body of a dead soldier. I think that's one of the poems. I think as poets we all have particular poems that we're trying to write almost. We've got one poem that we're always trying to emulate or recreate, and that's certainly one for me. The other one that I came across a little bit later, probably again when I was at university, was by this Scottish poet Andrew Gregg, and it's his poem Freefall in his collection Into You. It's about comparing a relationship to sort of dropping a stone down a well and waiting for the sound of it striking the bottom, and I've always been mesmerised by that poem, I suppose, and trying to capture something of the feeling that I got when I was reading it in my own writing. It is a bit different with each poem, but for me, I write a lot in my head before I even get near the paper. So by the time I'm at the paper stage, I've been living with the poem for quite a long time, often carrying it around for months perhaps. Usually for me it starts with an idea. I've got something that I really want to write about, but I won't go and try and write it at that point. I'll probably wait maybe a few months until the initial idea connects with something else, usually something slightly different, and you realise the strange link between these two things that you hadn't necessarily thought were connected. And then for me, my preferred or my best way of writing is that I'll go out for a walk or a run, and as I'm walking or running, these lines will start, so it's quite an auditory thing. I'll start to hear something, I suppose, and obviously without paper to write anything down on, I'll have to keep those lines in my head while I'm out running or walking. And I usually find, or at least I hope that this is the case, that by the time you've got back home, the lines that are weaker you've forgotten because they're not memorable enough, and the lines that are the strongest lines have stuck in your head. So when you then go and sit down with the paper, it's only the most memorable aspect of the poem that's stayed with you. It's the more resonant parts of the poem, I suppose. But yeah, so it's quite a labour-intensive way to write, I guess, because it takes me a long time to work out what I'm actually trying to say. And often the thing that you first, I guess Frost talks about this famously, like no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. The thing that you first think you're talking about isn't necessarily the thing that you're actually interested in. So I suppose the longest I've ever left a poem for was probably over a year thinking about it before I've even got near the paper. I don't know, I think I've always been quite bad at editing. I only really learned how to edit when I was doing a residency at the Wordsworth Trust, and I had time to live with the poems and sort of keep going back to them and not be prepared to leave them. And I have a friend who's also a poet who's pretty much the only person I send work in progress to. And a particular example is I was working on a long poem called Scab about the miners' strike when I was living in Grasmere at the Wordsworth Trust. And I kept thinking that the poem was finished. I'd send it to my friend and he'd write back and he'd say, no, it's not there yet, go back to it. And so I'd write some more, I'd send it back and I'd go, no, it's still not there yet. So sometimes you need other people to give you a bit of a push I think, to question your own work because you get so close to it that you can't really tell anymore. But I think it's also important that the person that edits your work with you is somebody that's sympathetic to what you're trying to do in the first place and understands your project, for want of a better word. And then kind of for yourself knowing which suggestions or criticisms to take on and which ones to trust your first instinct with. I think it can be quite a delicate balance. But I don't know if I ever finish editing my poems in a way. Working on a manuscript this past few years, there were poems I'd written years ago that I thought were finished, and even up to the last minute I've been going back and tinkering with them and changing them, and perhaps they're still not finished. I don't remember who it was who said that a poem is never finished, only abandoned, but I think it's quite true actually. Yeah, the editing work's never really over. I guess I'm obsessed with place, but it's almost the opposite thing for me. I write most about places when I'm not in them. Sometimes I think you can be so close to something that it's impossible to get that distance that you need to write. So the most I've ever written about Sheffield and Derbyshire, Chesterfield, the area where I grew up, is probably when I've not been living there. Particularly when I was living in the Lake District, surrounded by all this magnificent countryside, and it was almost too vast to write about that, and I found myself drawn more and more to where I'd grown up and writing about those landscapes instead, being away from them. And I think my poetry is always rooted in a very acute sense of place because I'm really fascinated by where we come from, or more importantly where we think we come from, which isn't always the same. I think sometimes your sense of home doesn't correspond with where you're really from, or the home that you remember or the place you imagine growing up in isn't the same as the place as it is. And I think those little differences, that small gap between imagined place and real place, is what a lot of my poetry sort of circles around. Whether it ever gets close to it, I don't know, but it certainly circles around it, I think, yeah. There probably are, but it would be impossible to. I think it's a more subtle change than that. You couldn't suddenly say, right now, stop writing like this. I think it's more, it evolves, I guess. And it evolves with experience at editing as well. And perhaps awareness of editors and audience maybe makes your writing more mannered sometimes. And that's always something I'm quite wary of, and less natural. And maybe, I can certainly think of times when I've been writing quite heavily in metre, or well, an imagined metre anyway. I thought that I was writing to this particular metre, but I won't have consciously decided to write a poem in iambic pentameter. It's more that I've heard that sort of rhythm, and the poem hasn't sounded right unless it's sort of come out like that. So, and there are probably times when I've done that more than others, and other times more free verse. But yeah, I guess if we knew what the voice of our poems really was, or if we knew how they sounded, we probably wouldn't be able to write. You'd be too self-conscious about the voice you were projecting to the reader. I think you need both, definitely. You can't write about something if you're too close to it. Because I've always been a big believer in the idea that to get close to the poetic truth, if you like, or the truth of a poem, it's sometimes necessary to lie, or it's necessary to diverge from what the real world truth was. I think it's interesting that you can be more true to an experience sometimes by telling it slant, or by saying what it wasn't even rather than what it was. But at the same time, you need to know why you're writing about something, why it matters. I think it was Ted Hughes who once said something to do with you need to work out what are the subjects or what are the things in your life that you die to be parted from, not just something you read about in the papers yesterday and it raised a passing curiosity, but what's a deep part of your life. And that investment in the poem is really important. I guess the best example for me again is this long poem I was working on about the miners' strike. It took me a long time to work out why I needed to write that poem rather than many other people that might be better qualified because they were alive at the time of the strike, or they were involved even, and it didn't quite click into place until I realised that I wasn't just writing about the Battle of Orgreave. I was also writing about other places that I'd been, particularly living in Cambridge, and this juxtaposition of two different worlds and the idea of being a traitor in some way to something that, or somewhere that you come from. So that personal investment was really important to writing the poem, but I also needed some abstraction to write it too, and I ended up looking at some of it through the lens of a film called The Battle of Orgreave by Jeremy Deller. So I think you need both at the same time to write properly, or to do the poem justice. That's a tricky question, but a good one. I think poetry should never ignore people. If it does, then it's not serving its communicative function. I know that people have different aims and motivations to why they write, and some people would definitely disagree, but for me, I think, I don't know what we can hope to do with poetry, but for me, if I can write something that gives at least one reader, maybe more would be great, but at least one reader that sense of being alive, that sense of excitement that I got when I was reading poems like the Wilfred Owen poem or the Andrew Gregg poem that I was talking about earlier. If I can connect with them in some way, if I can make them see things slightly differently, then I'd be happy, even if it's just one or two people in the world. I think communication in general is such a difficult thing. It's so difficult to say what you really mean and to make somebody understand what you mean, that even to do that briefly and in the contained way that you can do within a poem, then that's an amazing thing. So I guess I'm saying poetry should never ignore people, in my opinion. Whether it does or not, I'm not sure. I think there's always going to be or maybe there's an assumption of exclusion sometimes, where people think that poetry is too difficult for them, and perhaps it's just that they haven't heard something that engages with them. I think that's been one of the great things about, well, I'm never sure about using the term, but performance poetry, but poetry that's written to be delivered off the page. It seems that, especially recently, that's connecting with people. And I always think that one of the best compliments you can get as a writer is if somebody comes up to you after a reading or something like that and says, "Oh, I don't read poetry, but I like that." That's who I'd like to write for, I think. Okay, my collection's called Division Street. It's going to be published in September, so it's not out just yet, and it's being published by Chatto and Windus, and it's my first sort of full-length collection. I've had pamphlets before, but yes, this is the first one, so it's a bit scary.
Is it rooted in Sheffield then?
It's very much rooted in Sheffield and Chesterfield in Derbyshire, and it's definitely rooted in places, specific places. But yeah, I think readers from around here would definitely recognise a lot of it, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a strange thing when you've written a book and you're waiting for it to be published, because you feel really detached from the poems in the book, especially when you've been editing them quite intensively. It doesn't feel like your work anymore. And it's also quite hard to move on to the next project while you're waiting for the book to come out, I think. So the last year or so has been pretty slow for me, but I'm working on a collection of poems inspired by the early days of women's mountaineering, which is something I'm quite interested and passionate about. And I like those links between the body and the mind in writing, if you can sort of combine the two. So I'm trying to work on this series of poems about various different female mountaineers, but particularly the late climber from Derbyshire, Alison Hargreaves. So I'm combining two of my real interests, climbing and poetry, which is good. So I don't know when that'll emerge, and it's not exactly cross-disciplinary, but it's sort of touching on things outside of the world of writing, I guess. Biggest piece of advice I'd give is definitely read widely and read with love, I suppose. Sort of read things because you enjoy them and because it's a kind of, or not. Reading doesn't have to just mean on the page. Go to things, hear things, just be open to different things that might inspire you, I suppose. Yeah, and also don't be too afraid to just trust your own writing, your own voice. You do need to listen to what other people say, and as I was saying earlier, editing's crucial. But I think at first it's more important to work out what you want to say first and what you care about, and then worry about audience afterwards. Yeah, those would be my two main pieces of advice. I think I'd like to do more of that. I'm really interested in sound in poetry and delivery off the page, because I think poems are written to be heard as much as they're written to be read. I'm not a talented sort of performer myself, so I tend to admire it more in other people, but I'd definitely be interested in trying to, working with musicians or artists. I think when those things work, when you find the point of connection between your work and theirs, I think it can be great, but I think it can be quite difficult to find that connection, and it can end up seeming a bit arbitrary, but when it works, it really, really works. So yeah. I think it can be, yeah. Stuff like this actually, to have things that are accessible online. I mean, there's so much poetry you can access now at the touch of a button. It's amazing. At the same time, I think it can encourage people to put things out into the public domain too quickly, because it's so easy and because you can just publish it instantly. Poetry also takes time, and I think new media, new technologies are great as long as they're not making people take shortcuts with the writing itself. Once the writing's there and it's finished and you've spent time with the poetry, then I think it's great to disseminate it as widely as possible and reach out to people in that way, in as many forms as you can use, really. But the poetry itself is not a Facebook medium, I don't think. It's not a quick, instant kind of thing, and it takes time to get it right. I'm sure people have heard of her already, but I think Kate Tempest is really inspiring to watch if you want to see somebody that's got a really unique voice, actually, and that's very passionate about what she says and delivers it in a way that makes you feel like, yeah, this is the most important thing in the world. I love it when poetry does that, when it's sort of it makes you think that something couldn't have possibly been said in another way. But other than that, I guess I go back to, it's not so much new poets, but old poets that I go back to, and I'd encourage anybody to have a dialogue with them as well. Poetry never gets old, because you can have as good a conversation with a poet who's been dead for hundreds of years as you can with a contemporary one. That's the nature of the reading experience, I think. So yeah.